Hi, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. So thank you for coming to tonight's now virtual program. My name is Madison Perrian, and I'm the branch manager of our Ottawa Hills Library. We also have Julie Taberer and Steve Asarian here running the tech and chat and our screening room at the main library. Julie is the head of the Grand Rapids History Center, and Steve is our business and career librarian. So first of all, I want to start by thanking the Grand Rapids Public Library Foundation for funding this talk through the Vanderveen Center for the Book. If you enjoy these types of programs and would like to see them continue, please consider a donation to the foundation. Before we get started, I have just a few housekeeping items. So the first is that questions and comments are welcome in the chat or the Q&A feature through Zoom. We'll collect those questions as we go and then share them with Dr. Curtis at the end of his presentation. If anyone is joining from the main library, please share your questions with Steve, who can pass them along to us. And second, we were planning to have local bookstore Books and Mortar at our in-person event for book sales and signing. But with the turn to virtual, instead, we're going to be offering a raffle for folks living in Grand Rapids to win a free copy of Dr. Curtis's book, Muslims in the Heartland. So after the event, please make sure to fill out a digital survey and include your name and email in the additional feedback section to enter to win the raffle. We will contact you following the event, and then winners will be able to pick up their book from the library branch of their choice. If you are not a raffle winner, don't fear. Jess from Books and Mortar is here to share a special deal that they'll be offering for copies of Dr. Curtis's books. Go ahead, Jess.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm Jess from Books and Mortar Bookstore. We are a proudly progressive, consciously curated, and fiercely independent neighborhood bookstore in the East Hills neighborhood of Grand Rapids. If you haven't been there before, it's on Cherry Street, 966 Cherry Street Southeast. We were, if our love for books is overtaken by anything, it is community building. So we're really excited to partner with the library at events like this, and we're big fans of this book. So we're looking forward to seeing you all today, but of course we're at the mercy of the weather here in Michigan. So we want to make sure that if you don't win the book, heaven forbid, you can still grab it locally. So we have lots of extra copies that we got into the store for this event. So we will have some copies for you. And if you mention this event to any bookseller, it might be me if it's in the next couple of days, might be somebody else, but everybody will know. If you mention this event, you'll get 25% off that book. So just say that you were part of this event and we'll give you 25% off. So you can still grab the book locally. Thank you so much for joining virtually. I'm looking forward to the talk.
Thank you so much, Jess, for being here virtually and in person and offering that discount. We appreciate it. So now I would like to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Edward Curtis. He is here tonight to talk about his book, Muslims of the Heartland. We're especially glad to have Dr. Curtis here because we know there is a rich history of the Syrian community here in Grand Rapids. In our archives at the main library on level 4, we preserve photographs, documents, and oral histories that help to tell that story. The experience of Muslim Americans is not fully represented, however. So if you are interested in learning more about that or you have ideas for us, we'd love to talk with you. Please feel free to drop your feedback in the chat or include it in your events survey, and someone from the library will be sure to reach out to you to connect. Edward Curtis is a publicly engaged scholar of Muslim American, African American, and Arab American history and life. He is the William M. and Gail M. Plater Chair of the Liberal Arts at Indiana University School of Liberal Arts and descendant of the first Arabic-speaking people to settle in the Midwest. Curtis holds a doctorate in religious studies from the University of South Africa, a master's in history from Washington University, and a BA in religion from Kenyon College. He grew up in Southern Illinois. He is the award-winning author or editor of 14 books, who has also contributed interviews and articles to the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, National Public Radio, and the Associated Press. One of his most recent books, Muslims of the Heartland, How Syrian Immigrants Made a Home in the American Midwest, is the subject of our book talk today. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Curtis. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Madison. Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Jess. I'm so glad that a community-owned bookstore, Books and Mortar, is selling the book, and hope you'll support them. If not by purchasing my book, then in some other way. So it's exciting to be part of this community-based endeavor today, and that's really that Muslims of the Heartland is public history. It's written, by a member of the community, for the community, and with the community. And it's the story of just 12 or so families out of the 500,000 Arabic-speaking people who came to the Americas before 1920. About 100,000 of them arrived from Syria in the United States, 100,000 in Brazil, 100,000 in Argentina, and 200,000 spread across the Americas. That's 1 out of every 5 Syrians. And when we say Syrians, we're talking about the lands that are now Palestine, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. At the time, the Eastern Mediterranean was all one sort of region that was ruled by the Ottoman Empire. Academics, professors oftentimes tell you which theorist inspired them or undergirds their approach. Well, my main inspiration and my theorist for this book was my maternal grandmother, the Arab grandmother who brought me up as a proud Arab, a Syrian, and a Lebanese in southern Illinois, Cassie Hemoe Moses Safa Caffrey. And the only way that I could ever imagine this book, that is to theorize it, was because of the stories that she told me. And I knew that there was a regional, not just a local story, but a regional story to tell about the Midwest. So where did those 12 or so families come from? They came from what today is Lebanon, was then a part of Ottoman Syria, and they came from the villages that you can see on the Lebanese side of this map, from villages like Ben Jbeil, Tibnin, Insar, Aramta, Kfar Huna. And these, you can tell, most of them are from very small places then, not large places. But why did they come to the Midwest? Why not New York? I mean, some of them did land in New York, but most of these people were Christian. Of those 500,000 were Christian. The minority was Muslim, but a large number of Muslims came to the Midwest. Now, why would they do that? This map of U.S. railroads in 1901 helps to show that. First of all, there was the means to get here to the Midwest. More than that, the Midwest was an economic powerhouse of this country in the Gilded Age. This is why in 1893, Chicago hosted the World's Fair, and Chicago was a symbol. It brought together all those railroads that had their terminus in Chicago, brought together 2 economic phenomenon: an incredible agricultural revolution and an industrial revolution along the Great Lakes. And those generated labor opportunities for which these immigrants came. They were also pushed out of the Eastern Mediterranean by a bad economy, one that didn't have a place for them because it was undergoing modernization, and all the jobs that were available were no longer available for them. So I have what are called takeaways during this talk, sort of main points. But one of them is that, and I kind of mentioned this already, is that the lives of Ottoman Syrian Muslims reveal how the Midwest worked as an interconnected region, a human geography in the early 1900s. What do I mean by human geography? What I mean is that if you just look at the sort of natural geography of the Midwest. A lot of the parts of our region don't go together. What do the short grass prairies of the Western Dakotas have to do with the very, thickly forested and far balmier parts of southern Indiana and southern Illinois? Well, it was human beings who forged this region and its regional identity. And sometimes a small group can illuminate a big idea. And that's exactly what happened with the Syrian Muslims about whom I'm talking this evening. So I really try to help readers get into what it looked like, what it felt like, even what it smelled like to be one of these Syrian Muslim settlers. And I take readers across the Midwest. And one of the places that we go is Michigan City, which at the time had Indiana's largest employer, the Haskell-Barker Railroad Car Company, making railroad cars. You see this beautiful little Haskell-Barker caboose on your screen. And so John Barker wanted to recruit immigrant labor, and he liked to recruit Arabic speakers. He figured that they didn't speak English well, and so they would be far less likely to organize unions, so that because they wouldn't be able to communicate with non-Arabic speakers. And so he actively recruited them to work in Michigan City. One of the ways in which I tried to recapture their lives was by using city directories, but I oftentimes had to find sort of figure out who was who. It was confusing because people would share the same names at times. For example, J. Ali. I mean, there are 4 Joseph Alis around 1900 in Michigan City, and they all work for Haskell and Barker, and they even live near each other. So I had to, really kind of, I had to triangulate and figure out who was who using multiple sources. So one of the reasons they came to Michigan City was for industrial jobs. Just like I said, there was an industrial revolution. Those were opportunities. But another reason that they came to the Midwest was exemplified by the Ogdi family from South Dakota, or in Arabic, you could say Oqdi or A'di. In modern standard, Oqdi, for those of you who speak Arabic, and in Lebanese colloquial, A'di. So these A'dis came, and they really, one of the through characters that you find at the beginning and the end of the book is Alia A'di Hassan, who's on the right side of this picture. I think it's the right one. And Alia, her parents are Fatima and Ali, and they move from the Bekaa Valley in what is today Lebanon to South Dakota. And the reason that they move first is, and Ali Ogdi comes first, and he's a peddler, and he lives on the Big Sioux River. And in the very left part of your screen, in the yellow colored boarding house, and I discovered that through city directories and the U.S. Census, right on that river. And he could find virtually anything he needed as a single man. But Fatima joins him eventually, and they go and they file a homestead claim. And many of these later immigrants, including Russians, Scandinavians, and Syrians, file homestead claims in the western part of the Dakotas because that land had only been taken away stolen from Native Americans in very, very late and surveyed for the purpose of homesteading in 1890. It's not clear whether Ali Ogdi knew that this was the case. He was illiterate. He was unable to read and write in both Arabic and in English, and never learned how. So what his knowledge was is not clear. But he moved out to Kadoka, which is right by the Badlands. Very hard to farm, very hard life. In fact, I'll go back to Fatima for a minute. One day, Fatima, the mom, was out taking care of the kids, hanging up the wash to dry, and a rattlesnake comes up, kills the dog, goes for the kids. She takes some kind of farm implement, a hoe or something, kills the rattlesnake. And when Ali gets home, says to her husband, look, enough is enough. We're either moving into Sioux Falls, the big city, or I'm going back to Syria. So they oblige and they move to Sioux Falls, and that's where their kids are brought up. He does prove up. He does get his land, but he becomes mostly a businessman, a small businessman in Sioux Falls. Okay, so this is why they come, for these economic opportunities. They're for the most part. Now, once they get here, do they face discrimination? And the answer is, socially, they always face discrimination. Legally, it depends on locality and era. First of all, the fact that they could file a homestead indicates that they have some rights. That's an important, because not everyone is allowed to file for a homestead. If you're ineligible for naturalized citizenship in the United States, you're not allowed to file a homestead claim and prove up on your land. So that's a form of, so it depends on the time and place. In Cedar Rapids, Iowa, for example, before World War I, Syrians are often seen as another white ethnic immigrant group. And city officials defend their whiteness, their white identity, and their citizenship eligibility against federal prosecution when the Department of Commerce and Labor decides that, you know what, Syrians aren't white, and sends out federal marshals and says, you know, you got to stop naturalizing, giving these people naturalized citizenship. Well, in the Midwest, many local officials revolt against this, and you can see this in the Cedar Rapids Evening Gazette. A lot of powerful people in Cedar Rapids stand up and say, no, that's not fair. And one of the reasons, as I show in the chapters on Cedar Rapids, is because Cedar Rapids is a multi-ethnic town where no one white ethnic group dominates, is in a majority, and there is a very powerful Bohemian minority that has already made a space for the expression of a non-Anglo culture. If you walk down the streets in Cedar Rapids in 1900, you'll see a lot of Czech language up on the buildings. There's a Sokolovna gymnasium. You can take Czech language at night. And this is why, to this day, the National Museum of the Czech and Slovak Heritage is in Cedar Rapids. And so already, you know, this is a place that is more welcoming as long as you're on the white side of the color line. Of course, Black people and Latinx people often not perceived as being on the side of that, and natives. But Syrians are to a greater or lesser degree. They may face social prejudice, but they have more legal rights. That's very different than in Michigan City, Indiana, which I already, you know, where Barker built his cars, right? And before World War I, in Michigan City, Indiana, Syrians are people of color. They're not considered to be white. They're subject to police violence as well as social and legal discrimination. I already mentioned how a lot of this, the context is they were brought to Michigan City to be laborers, and sort of as the working class, they are unable to obtain those rights. It's against the economic interests of the powers in town for them to be treated as full citizens. So what do? Well, like other people of color, the only way that they can develop, that they can inhabit public space, is to entertain white people. And so for sports or singing or dancing. And one of the things that they do is they develop a huge culture, the Syrian Muslims, of wrestling. And when I saw Yusuf Hussein, I thought on your right of your screen, he was not from Michigan City. He was actually from Michigan, I think Battle Creek, but check me on that. And he was so popular in Michigan City that he had his own fan club there. And the paper reports on all of his matches, even when they're on the East Coast. And so when I saw this of this Adonis like Yusuf Hussein, the Terrible Turk. By the way, there are over a dozen people who have gone by Terrible Turk as a moniker in wrestling. This Terrible Turk reminded me of my grandfather, who was, had abdominal muscles of steel until the day he died. He was recruited out of a broken Arrow, Oklahoma, to play for Newt Rockne at Notre Dame, where he met my Arab grandmother, who was at St. Mary's College. Again, another Midwestern sort of story, and ended up living in Cairo, not Cairo, Illinois. So anyway, I knew this. I knew that how much these men valued their masculinity, their manhood was very much vested in physical strength, in part as a way to show that they were men in the midst of a very sort of emasculating environment where they were not able to operate as full citizens of the United States. But World War I is a very important turning point in the political lives of Syrian Muslims in the Midwest. In Michigan City, the city's first conscript is a Syrian Muslim, what is still called at that time a Turk. These are not Turkish-speaking people from Anatolia. These Turks are Arabic-speaking Syrians from the Eastern Mediterranean, but they call them Turks. Muhammad Dabaja is on your right with the flag. He signs up, and this then leads to a change in white attitudes towards Syrians, because when one of those Joseph Alis that I pointed out earlier is discriminated against at the public beach, a jury of his white peers sides with him, and he helps to integrate during World War I the beach in Michigan City, at least for Syrian Muslims. Black people would not be allowed on that beach until the 1960s. It still was, it was still segregated for Black people for a long time. This turning point then leads to a decision among many Syrian Muslims to stay in the United States, not to go back to Syria, which in the Allied victory over the Ottoman Empire and Germany in World War I, divide up the lands of these Syrians into 4 mandates: Transjordan, Palestine, Syria, and Lebanon. So they decide to stay, and between World War I and World War II, they then build Muslim religious congregations, which, like other Midwest religious congregations, build cultural, social, and political power. They were not building these mosques to somehow say, hey, we're different, as much as, hey, we're just like other Americans who have their ethnic religious heritage preserved so that we can participate in society. So these are pathways, not impediments to assimilation. Assimilation here meaning participation, the ability to participate in a society. The first is in Highland Park, Michigan in 1921. Then in Ross, North Dakota in 1929. If you go to the Arab American National Museum in Dearborn, one of the doors, you see the door on what seems to be the sort of entrance or outbuilding going into this, what they often call the basement mosque. It's preserved there, and you can see that door in the museum. Then in Michigan City, Indiana, about 3 blocks from Lake Michigan itself, the Asr al-Jadid congregation in 1931. And then the only of these buildings which still exists, the Muslim temple, or Al-Nadi al-Islami, meaning the Islamic Club in Cedar Rapids, 1934, now affectionately called the Mother Mosque oftentimes. One of the reasons during the height of the Great Depression that they were able to build these, mosques was because many of them had gone from peddling to grocery store. And grocery stores were not just places to buy food. Grocery stores were important financial institutions, and their success as grocery store owners generated income and credit essentially for not just for them, for the whole community, and allowed them to build their mosques. Oftentimes they were absolutely an important part of their, as a pillar of the community. So during the 30s, they drive long distances to bury each other's dead, to celebrate each other's weddings. It's a intergeneration. Often their social events are intergenerational. That is, they not just one generation, not just the old, but also the young, the first, second, and in some cases now the third generation getting together like they did in Kruger Park, Michigan City, Indiana. This says in Arabic, Ihtifal Jamiyat al-Asr al-Jadid al-Islami. So the gathering of the new generation or new era Islamic society. That's their mosque. Most of these people would have been Shia Muslims. And you can see that, but not all. The Sunnis also prayed there, Sunnis and Shias together. And you'll see the guys wearing newspaper boy, Great Gatsby hats in this picture, and some women wearing hijabs, and then other women are wearing flapper girl fashions, the flapper girl hats, for example. So you see a lot of diversity among this Arabic-speaking population here in terms of sartorial diversity. For that second generation, many of them didn't see a contradiction, despite what some outsiders may have thought, but they didn't see a contradiction between being fully American and fully Muslim. I mean, Abe Hamid, for example, he competed in his, local 4-H sponsored, who has the best Holstein in the county fair. You can see him here with his bovine. And then, he also, if you look at the left side of your screen, that was the Quran from which he learned the Quran, and very old handwritten Quran, and he did both. This wasn't some sort of contradiction. In fact, it's hard to imagine in some ways how much a part of the community Syrian Muslims became in Cedar Rapids. Iowa's Secretary of State celebrated the anniversary of the mosque there. Sometimes today, politicians don't like to set foot in mosques because they're somehow afraid of being perceived as negative. Well, Iowa's Secretary of State did it in 1937, and the English newspaper printed it, the Gazette. So they had remarkable, these communities were remarkably vibrant, and the fate of them largely depended on historical forces like agricultural economics and industrial growth, not any lack of individual effort or desire of the communities to sustain their congregations. The question was whether you could maintain a critical mass of Syrian Muslims, and by this point, Syrian and Lebanese Muslims, to sustain those communities. Certainly in Detroit and Dearborn, that happened, but not everywhere else. For example, in North Dakota. So first of all, in the 1920s, before the Great Depression, there is a horrible agricultural depression. And there's drought almost every year. And these lands these lands are not meant to be intensively farmed. I mean, at best they can be used for grazing, but in many cases they shouldn't be used at all for agriculture. All of the people you see on your screen are Syrian Muslims who worked very hard in very harsh conditions, including living in tar paper shacks and 30 degree below weather at times, at the worst, at the extremes. And, they worked hard, and men and women were involved. Mary Juma, who's on your right, she peddled during the winter. She broke the sod in the fields. So they were very hardworking people, but there was very little they could do. Plus, North Dakota, it got the fewest military contracts in World War II. So starting in World in North Dakota, you have depopulation overall, and not just of Syrian Muslims. There was also the success of the automobile industry in Greater Detroit attracted many of these people, whether it was Sergeant Ali Joseph Saeed's family from Michigan City, or this is that little baby, Alia Abdi Hassan. That's what she looked like as an adult. She moved also to Detroit. and which really became the capital, the city that you know of the Arab Muslim Midwest, where now in Dearborn, half of the street signs are in Arabic. Now, a lot of that is due to post-1965 immigration, but before, why did those post-65 immigrants go there? Well, there were already third and fourth generation Arabic-speaking Muslims and Christians in Greater Detroit by that time. And they brought all their cultural capital and their success, their savoir-faire to Dearborn and Detroit. Before I hear your questions or take your questions and hear your comments, I want to, in this part of our time together, with an observation about what writing this book meant to me personally. So I actually begin the story with my own family's story. I started to suspect that even though most of my family was Christian, that we had some Muslim ancestors. I actually only confirmed that after the book was published. But I put my suspicions of that. But whether they were Muslim or Christian, what my Arab grandmother taught me was that that there were, despite or no matter what their identity was, that these Arabic-speaking people shared a lot in common. And I found that all along as I was writing this book. And coming to know their stories made me feel differently about, I developed new feelings about the place where I grew up in rural Southern Illinois. I grew up in a small town, but Southern Illinois is quite rural. And when I was growing up, one of the most popular questions that I was asked was, as a brown-skinned boy who didn't have a foreign accent, was, what are you? What are you? What are you? Not who are you? What? Which meant sort of what race are you? Or if they were polite, what nationality are you? But it really meant, what race are you? They couldn't quite figure me out. I felt like a foreign intrusion in the place I was completely attached and where I was raised. And that was a difficult experience. But writing this made me change my thinking about it in a lot of ways. It made me change my thinking because I began to see just how much of a part people who were like me had been a part not only of the cities, but also of the rural Midwest, and how really our story was much more similar to everybody else's story. The Midwest, before Afro-Eurasian settlers ever got here, was already diverse with all kinds of different Native American nations. And then when the settlers came, we were white, brown, and black. We were never, and what I realized, that I had accepted the lazy stereotype of the rural Midwest as being a bleached out white flyover country, even though I knew from my family it was never just that. And writing this book began to really spur my imagination of going back into the past, of rediscovering who we really have been as a region, one that has always been racially, ethnically, and religiously diverse, to inspire a Midwest that loves all of its people and loves us abundantly. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm looking forward to a chat with you now. I'm going to, let's see, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, I do believe. Yes. There we go. Did that work?
Yes.
Great.
Thank you so much, Edward. So like Edward said, we're going to open it up now for Q&A. feel free to drop any comments or questions in the chat, or you can use the Q&A feature that's at the bottom of your screen through Zoom. We haven't had any questions come in quite yet, so I can just share something that I was thinking about during your presentation. It's really fascinating. You talk about like location and legality as kind of an important part of racial identity, even during the same time period. And when we talk about location, like you're focused on the Midwest, which seems like such a small like subset of location. So I was just wondering how that theme came up for you as you did your research of like location and people's identities changing from where they were.
This was one of the most surprising discoveries that I made, and I think you're absolutely right on. In fact, when another expert on Arab Americans in the Midwest read the book when it was just a manuscript, she commented, this is one of the book's main contributions, is to really show the textures of different kinds of participation. And it's not just from locality, of course, your gender would matter in many cases. I mean, one of the things that was so fascinating was that there's a book coming out from Charlotte Albrecht about women peddlers, and oftentimes the social workers in Chicago and other places and Minneapolis and wanted to put the Arab women back in the home. They thought having them out on the street peddling was, obscene. And so gender could make a difference. And I think that it's possible that Cedar Rapids was very, even though it also had its share of discrimination, that it could have been an exception. I mean, it's sort of exceptional, because in most other places, I found, the kinds of challenges to the white identity, especially of Muslims. Oftentimes Muslims had a kind of double, were doubly oppressed, in that in many communities, Syrian Christians would try to actually say, no, we're the people who can become good Americans, and say, but those Muslims aren't capable because of their religion of becoming good Americans, and would blame problems in the community on the Muslims. So that now there was also cooperation, but it was fascinating to me to see where those points of tension were and where there was cooperation. One of the things is, with the exception of Maronites, so the Christians were generally either Orthodox Christian, Maronite, which is a branch of the Roman Catholic Church but doesn't practice the Latin Mass, or Melkite, which is even closer to the Roman Catholics. And they would, with the exception of the Maronites, many of the Christians were very anti-imperialist, were very much against French occupation of Syria and Lebanon. And they united with Muslims across the Midwest in trying to convince their government, the American government, the U.S. government, to oppose occupation and to favor independence. So anyway, I saw all of these textures across the region.
That's so interesting. Thank you.
Of course. Yeah, I see Julie there. Go ahead, Madison.
Yeah, great. We've also got a question right above Julie here that I want to share. So thank you so much for such an insightful talk. Do you think earlier waves of immigrants were more interested in assimilating than later ones?
No, I don't think so. Now, if assimilation means that, if it means that you're wiping away every bit of your heritage and trying to become something completely new, I think that's actually the exception in the United States rather than the rule. The rule in the United States is that, for the most part, people have always seen their ethnic group as being essential to building the kind of economic, political, and cultural power that they need in order to compete in American society for resources. So think about why do we associate the Irish with the police in Boston, for example? Why do we, there's the various businesses, various sort of industries become associated with various ethnic groups, right? And that's in part because people within an ethnic group are cooperating with one another. Well, if your ethnicity is important to your survival in America, it's important that you then somehow honor and preserve that heritage. That's what links you together. And in the Midwest in particular, even as much as any other place, it was the religious congregation that distinguished your group as having public power. Where did you raise money for charity? Where did you get the power to participate and protect one another? You got it in your ethnic religious congregation. Whether you were a Black Protestant, like a Black Baptist or a Black Methodist, if you were a Sephardi or an Ashkenazi Jew, if you were a holiness Pentecostal, a holiness Scandinavian, if you were a Polish Catholic or an Italian Catholic, you could, in 1900, you would, if you take the time machine back to our region in 1900, there are all these ethnic religious congregations. People are spending more of their time, talent, and resources building their distinctive ethnic religious congregation than they are on any other charity or philanthropic endeavor. To this day, religion, America is very different in this way. Religion is the number one recipient, not libraries. Religion is the number one recipient of philanthropic dollars. And that was all based on the ethnic religious group. So that's what my point is about. They were being American by building these Arab Muslim congregations. That's what it meant to participate in America. I see today, we see a very different kind of Muslim identity. The ethnic mosque or congregation is now, it can be popular among, for example, first generation West Africans. Senegalese build their own mosques. But in many cases, Arabic speakers are joining with people from South Asia and with Iranians and Turks and Bosnians to build, and Africans, as well as sub-Saharan Africans, to build inter-ethnic or multi-ethnic Muslim congregations that are oftentimes distinguished not so much by their ethnicity, but by their main interpretations of Islam, how they interpret the religion. So that is, and the one exception to that is that there are still more American-born Black mosques than not in the Muhammad community, for example, or in historically Black Sunni African-American mosques. So they were, I don't see how earlier waves of immigrants were more interested in assimilating than later ones. I actually see them as so similar. I see them as similar, especially if they're from the working class, the figuring out how to make a way in America. Now, when we are talking about rich immigrants, of course, then we need to have a different conversation, because wealth can open a lot of doors that, for those who have it, compared to immigrants who don't have it. And so class is as important to the issues of how you assimilate as any other factor here. One of the things that we have post 65 is a fairly either a wealthy or a mostly wealthy class of professionals, doctors, engineers, Muslims who were specifically got visas because they were professionals. And in those cases, you find them building those multi-ethnic mosques, but also, for example, where I am and really across the country, you find them living not in multiracial neighborhoods, but rather in majority white neighborhoods.
Thank you for answering that and for your your own definition of assimilation. I think that was really helpful for the presentation to kind of frame that lens. So thank you.
Yeah, I think some people would say, well, that's acculturation, or, you know, but but I really think that it's the mainstream story of America, and I just think we've undertold the story. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. We've got another question here. Let me find it. Was it easy to find information to tell the story, or was your research challenging to find those details?
Yeah, that's a great question. The it was okay, so I could have never written this book 10 years ago. And the reason I couldn't have written this book 10 years ago was because I was trained as a graduate student in the 1990s as an analog researcher. We still used the physical card catalog in the 1990s. I still used the physical Reader's Guide to Periodic Literature in the 1990s. And I read microfilm. None of it was digitized. You sat in front of a microfilm reading machine, you know, and you just went page to page to page. Now, but it took a long time for me to finally learn how to do digital research. And it's because of the digitization of things like Sanborn insurance maps, city directories, birth and death records, ship manifests, let's see, and most importantly, newspapers. You know, this is the digitization. Now in Michigan City and in Ross, North Dakota, they hadn't been digitized. So I had to sit there in front of the machine and just go page to page. But in every other place, all I had to do was enter a keyword search. And suddenly all the 3,000 articles on Syrians written in Michigan from 1890 to 1910 come up. And I think that was so important to finding out things. There are things in this book that no scholar of Islam in America has written about, in part because that digital research just hadn't been done yet. And so there was and again, I was a little late to the party, but now that these sources were available. Now, all of that said, the thing that gave this book the stories of individuals like Alia Ogdi Hassan, and that allowed me to talk about how people felt, and not just where they were and what they did, but how they felt and how that changed over time, was because of oral history memoirs, most of which were recorded by Arab American historian Alixa Naff and are currently in the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, but also in the Bentley Library at the University of Michigan. And at local libraries, I would find oral history interviews at local libraries, like at the Michigan City Public Library, also at the State Historical Society of North Dakota, and at the History Center in Lynn County in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. So the fact that librarians and local historians, and oftentimes just citizens, people who aren't like professionals, just amateur, who want to record the oral histories, they gave me the data that I needed in order to really talk about these people as my characters as three-dimensional people. And if I didn't have those sources, I didn't write about them. I only wrote about people whose lives I could really paint in all their complicated detail, as much as I could. So that was sort of how I went about, and how I chose who was going to be in it, and how I went writing the book. There are other Muslims in the Midwest during this time, right? And lots of other Syrian Muslims, but I wrote people on whom I could get the most information.
Thank you so much. I'm not seeing any other questions here in the chat or Q&A. So I'm going to give just kind of our closing announcements and wrap up.
Okay.
So thank you to everyone who submitted a question. And thank you, Dr. Curtis, for being here this evening. And thanks to Books and Mortar for joining us virtually as well. Before you go, don't forget to fill out an events survey for a chance to win a free copy of Dr. Curtis's book, Muslims in the Heartland. Julie went ahead and dropped that link in the chat, so you should see it right there to fill out the survey. Please go ahead and include your name and your email in that additional feedback section for a chance to win. And don't forget, if you don't win our raffle, you can stop by Books and Mortar. They have copies of the book available at a 25% discount. There's also a link in the chat there if you want to purchase that online. They've got the discount code already factored in. So you can see the information for the bookstore located in the chat there, and then the direct link. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here.
Thank you, everybody.